Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story.
Subscribe, like, and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I stood in the center of the ballroom, the buzz of celebration humming all around me like a low electric current, champagne glasses clinking, cameras flashing, voices layered one over another in waves of congratulations and rehearsed admiration. There were banners with the company logo draped along the walls, tables lined with floral centerpieces in our signature brand colors, and a massive screen rotating images of our humble beginnings, a single dusty storefront, a handwritten sign above the door, and a grainy photo of my parents behind the counter, smiles wide, full of dreams they had no idea how to scale. And now here we were, a national brand with a $23 million investment secured, a new expansion blueprint approved, and our name etched into the future of American commerce like it had always belonged there. And I had done that. I had dragged that tiny corner shop up from the ground with blistered hands and spreadsheets soaked in midnight hours, built it inch by inch, deal by deal, campaign by campaign. Everyone in that room knew it was because of me. Investors had flown in from 3 different states to shake my hand and talk about next steps. Press releases had gone out that morning, interviews already scheduled for next week, congratulatory emails flooding my inbox faster than I could read them. My team, my people, the ones who'd been with me through the most brutal growth stages, stood in clusters across the room, proud and glowing, some even a little teary-eyed. The mayor's office had sent a congratulatory plaque. My assistant handed me a card from the governor's Business Advisory Council. A local news station was setting up for a brief on-air segment before dessert. It was everything this moment should have been, everything I had spent 10 years dreaming about. And for a few precious minutes, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, this was finally the moment they'd see me for what I was. Not just a daughter, not just a helper, but the leader who had built their dream into a dynasty. I should have known better. The moment it happened wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with a hush over the crowd or a sudden break in the music. It came quietly, wrapped in velvet and daggers, like most betrayals do. My mother, elegant as ever in a cream silk dress and her signature pearl earrings, slid beside me while the toast was being raised, her hand wrapping gently around mine in a gesture so tender it almost made me soften. She leaned in, her perfume familiar and heavy, and said it with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Your brother will make a better CEO, dear. You've done wonderfully, of course, but now it's time to let the real leader step in." For a moment, the room vanished. The music dulled, the lights blurred, and all I could hear was the sharp ring of those words carving into my ribs like a blade dipped in ice. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I didn't yank my hand away or let my expression twist into the disbelief clawing at the inside of my throat. I just nodded slightly, turned toward the guests, and raised my glass higher than before. To the next chapter, I said aloud, voice clear, smile perfect, tone gracious. But everything changed in me with that sentence. Because that wasn't just a comment. That wasn't just a misunderstanding or a misplaced compliment to smooth over later. That was a decision. That was a verdict. That was the moment they told me, in no uncertain terms, that my value was only valid up until the point where it made someone else's image shine brighter. 10 years of strategy, sacrifice, and sleepless nights, and still, I was only good enough to build the kingdom, not rule it. I watched the room differently after that. I watched my father shaking hands with men he'd never have met if I hadn't pushed us into regional markets. I watched my brother, Ethan, grinning like he'd already won a race he hadn't even trained for, wearing a suit he probably didn't buy with his own money, floating from group to group with a charisma that had always been just enough to fool strangers and never enough to actually produce results. I watched my mother bask in the praise like it was a spotlight built just for her, nodding along as someone said how the Monroe family legacy was stronger than ever. And all I could think was, I built this with my own 2 hands, and they would rather hand it to a man who had failed upward his entire life than let a woman, especially their daughter, own her throne. Later that night, after the guests were gone and the last of the wine had dried in half-empty glasses, I sat at my desk in the home office I'd barely used in months. I stared at my laptop screen in silence, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, my heart as still as stone. Then, without hesitation, I logged into the company's internal network and opened a file I hadn't touched in years, a file I created in the early days when I first realized love and loyalty didn't always belong in the same room as power and planning. It was labeled contingency. And as the screen lit up with outlines, protocols, and asset shifts that no one else even knew existed, I smiled for the first time all day. Because if they wanted to play games, they were about to learn exactly who they had underestimated. There's a certain kind of memory that doesn't fade with time. It just waits beneath the surface, pulsing quietly, ready to rise whenever life hands you a moment that feels painfully familiar. That was exactly what started to happen as I watched Ethan stroll through the office that following week, grinning like he'd been handed a crown, nodding at people who didn't even know his name until 2 days ago. He walked like he belonged in that space, like it hadn't taken me 10 brutal years to carve it out of stone with my bare hands. Like he wasn't the same boy who spent his 20s bouncing from one failed startup to another while I balanced growth forecasts and supplier negotiations before I even turned 30. It wasn't just arrogance, it was the entitlement of someone who had never been told no, never earned yes, and still believed the world would eventually hand him something just for showing up. And the worst part was, I could already see the old story beginning to repeat itself. I could see the script forming in people's minds, the charming younger brother returning from his entrepreneurial journey, the prodigal son ready to lead, while the sister who kept the ship afloat faded politely into the background with grace and humility. I knew that story well, because I'd grown up in it, memorized its chapters, carried the bitterness of its final pages like a weight in my chest since childhood. I remembered the birthdays where Ethan got bicycles with ribbons and video game consoles while I got books and practical shoes. I remembered him getting grounded for wrecking the family car and still being taken out for ice cream later that night because he's just a boy, he'll learn. I remembered my science fair trophies being met with polite applause while his fourth-place soccer medal was displayed on the living room mantel for months. Every time I brought home an award, the celebration lasted 15 minutes. Every time Ethan showed up with half-baked ambition and a sheepish grin, it became a family event. He didn't have to be excellent. He just had to be visible. I remembered the first time he tried to start a company, some digital fitness app that never made it past beta testing. My parents raved about how proud they were of his entrepreneurial spirit, never mind that he burned through nearly $80,000 of his trust fund in less than a year. The second attempt was a subscription box business that folded within 6 months because he forgot to pay taxes and overpromised to vendors he didn't even have contracts with. But every time he failed, they cushioned the fall, called it valuable experience, and praised him for thinking big. And me? I was the one who never asked for help, never demanded recognition, never dropped the ball. I was the one who stayed up late tweaking marketing strategies, flew to investor meetings solo, held the line when supply chains collapsed, and made sure every quarterly report stayed green even in the middle of economic storms. I was the one who turned a dusty family shop into a thriving brand, who knew every SKU by heart and every client by name. But I was never the one they bragged about to their friends, not the way they bragged about Ethan, even when there was nothing to brag about. And now here he was again, paraded around the building like a shiny new mascot, introduced at team meetings with phrases like fresh vision and modern energy, all while people glanced at me in confusion, unsure what role I was supposed to be playing in this bizarre theater. He hadn't even read our operations manual. He asked questions in meetings that revealed how little he understood about margins, logistics, or even basic workflow systems. But he spoke with confidence, and that, apparently, was enough. I kept my face composed, kept my voice steady, kept my observations quiet. I didn't argue. I didn't protest. I just watched. I paid attention to who smiled too easily, who nodded when they should have asked questions, who seemed confused but chose silence anyway. I let them make their assumptions because I already knew where this was going. I didn't need to warn anyone. I just needed them to keep showing me who they were when they thought I wasn't paying attention. And then it happened, just as I expected it would. Late one evening, as I was finalizing a client report, a quiet notification popped up in my inbox. It was a copy of a filing from the internal HR system. The subject line was short, almost bland, almost laughable in its simplicity. Preliminary CEO transition proposal. Monroe, Ethan. I stared at it for a moment, my fingers still poised over my keyboard, and then I slowly leaned back in my chair, letting the full weight of what they were attempting settle around me like smoke in a closed room. So this was the plan all along. They didn't just want me to step aside, they wanted me to disappear quietly, politely, conveniently, so the golden boy could take his seat without even realizing someone had warmed it for him first. And that was fine. Because while they were busy planning his coronation, I had already begun preparing the throne they'd never see coming. There's something oddly liberating about being underestimated, about watching people smile politely in your direction while they quietly count you out, not realizing you're already several moves ahead and stacking the dominoes behind their backs. That week, while my family and the so-called leadership team continued parading Ethan around like he was some messianic figurehead who'd dropped out of the clouds to rescue the company I had spent a decade building, I started moving chess pieces in places no one was looking. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't challenge the nonsense they were whispering behind closed doors. I just tightened the screws where it mattered most, strategically, quietly, and with the kind of precision only someone who truly built the system from the inside out could manage. I began by restructuring key departments under the guise of streamlining operations for upcoming expansion phases. That was the official line, anyway, the one I fed to the upper management in our weekly executive briefings. What I was actually doing was reassigning critical personnel, people I trusted implicitly, the minds behind the numbers, the architects behind the brand's most successful campaigns, out of general oversight and directly into my division. From the outside, it looked like simple efficiency. From the inside, it was a consolidation of power. These were people who had worked beside me in trenches no one else even knew existed. They didn't ask questions when I handed them new access keys and project outlines. They just nodded and got to work, like they always had, because loyalty isn't something you buy, it's something you earn in the quiet, ugly hours when no one else shows up. Then came the data firewalls. I personally oversaw the encryption of our trade secrets, supplier matrices, cost breakdowns, logistics partnerships, proprietary tech, all rerouted into a restricted system only accessible through a digital vault I had designed years ago, but never deployed until now. I watched as department by department fell under that veil of digital silence, all while Ethan walked around the building making vague comments about innovation and fresh energy, without understanding a single line of what was actually moving beneath his feet. I knew this had to be done quickly, but not carelessly. I needed to move in a way that didn't trigger alarms, but also couldn't be reversed once the dust started to settle. Every meeting I attended became a performance. Every email I sent was designed to look like business as usual, and every change I made came wrapped in polite language and corporate buzzwords that made people feel safe while the foundation shifted beneath their chairs. But the most important meeting I had that week wasn't with any of them. It was with Lisa Granger, the lead investor behind the $23 million deal, the woman who'd seen the growth curve of this company and knew damn well who had driven it. Lisa had always been sharp, the kind of professional who spotted nonsense before it finished the first sentence, and she'd never hidden her appreciation for how I handled business. So when I called and asked her to meet off-site, away from the noise and the eyes, she didn't hesitate. We sat across from each other in a quiet cafe downtown, the kind of place where no one asked questions, and the coffee was strong enough to cut through layers of unspoken tension. I laid everything out without flinching, what was happening inside the company, what had been said, what moves had been made without my knowledge, and what I intended to do in response. Lisa listened carefully, occasionally tilting her head, her expression unreadable until I finally paused and let the silence settle between us. Then she leaned forward, her eyes sharper than ever, and asked in that low, clipped tone I'd come to respect, "Are you walking away or pulling the rug?" I met her gaze and didn't blink. "Why not both?" I said, voice steady, calm, deliberate. "Let them keep the building if they want. I'll take everything that matters." She smiled then, not a wide grin, not a laugh, just a small, knowing curl at the corners of her mouth that told me she understood exactly what I meant. She asked what I needed from her, and I handed her a list, nothing outrageous, just subtle shifts in policy triggers, minor adjustments in contractual language, and one particular clause from the investment agreement that gave me the leverage I needed to trigger a separation if leadership stability was compromised. She read it all without flinching. "You already knew this might happen, didn't you?" she said. "I've known for years," I replied. "I just hoped it wouldn't." When we parted ways, she said only one thing: "Make sure you don't blink first." I didn't plan to. By the time I returned to the office, everything was already in motion. Staff transitions were finalized, digital restructuring was nearly complete, and a small but crucial notification had just been sent to the board secretary, scheduling a confidential board meeting for Monday morning. I didn't inform Helen. I didn't inform Ethan. I didn't breathe a word to the executive team. Because what they didn't know yet was that while they had spent the last week preparing for Ethan's promotion, I had spent the last decade preparing for this exact moment. There's something quietly intoxicating about watching a plan unfold exactly the way you designed it, not with chaos, not with noise, but with a kind of controlled precision that slices through everything around it like silk through air. While my family spent their time dressing up Ethan's title in empty buzzwords and rehearsed praise, while they polished his image and walked him through mock leadership scenarios like he was a child preparing for his first school play, I was orchestrating the real performance, the one they hadn't even seen coming, the one I'd been quietly scripting for years beneath the surface of all their arrogance and willful ignorance. Because I knew, long before this week ever happened, that the moment they tried to push me aside, I needed more than just outrage. I needed an escape plan that left them standing in an empty castle with all the walls still upright, but nothing of value left inside. It all started 3 years ago, in the final stages of the National Expansion Agreement. I remember sitting alone in the conference room, surrounded by drafts and legal contracts, staring at a clause I'd insisted be included even though no one thought we'd ever need it. At the time, my father thought I was being paranoid. My mother thought I was being coldly corporate, her favorite insult whenever I made a move that didn't include smiling politely and asking for permission. But I didn't care. I knew better than anyone how this family operated, how power shifted without warning, how loyalty was always conditional, and how easily people changed when success started piling up. So I carved out a clause so subtle, so buried in the language, it looked like a technicality to anyone who wasn't paying attention. It was called the Executive Realignment Contingency Clause, a string of dry legal phrasing that essentially granted me the right to trigger a structural separation if, at any point, a change in executive leadership threatened operational stability or stakeholder confidence. In plain terms, it meant that if the company's future was handed to someone unqualified or unstable, I could pull the plug on the national brand under my name, take everything tied to the intellectual property, and re-establish the business under a separate entity. With Lisa's support and my majority shareholding in the national branch, it gave me full rights to proprietary materials, licensing agreements, and key supplier contracts. And now, all these years later, that little clause was no longer a precaution. It was a lifeline and a weapon. By Friday afternoon, it was activated. I didn't make a grand announcement. I didn't storm into a boardroom with papers flying and fists pounding tables. Instead, I gathered my private team, the real backbone of the brand, the ones who had stood beside me through every storm and late-night overhaul, and I sat them down in a closed-door meeting. I looked each of them in the eye and told them the truth, not the corporate version, not the press release version, but the real version. "We're spinning off," I said, my voice calm, measured, but unshakably certain. "Let them keep the name if they want it. I'm taking the legacy. The soul of this company doesn't live in the logo, it lives in the work we've built together, and that's coming with me." No one asked why. No one protested. They knew what had been happening behind the scenes. They had seen the disrespect mounting, had heard the whispers about Ethan being the face of the future, had watched my authority quietly chipped away while my family smiled through every blow. They nodded, one by one, and by the end of the meeting, we had already begun migrating everything that mattered: client contracts, internal systems, supplier communications, and most importantly, the trademark designs and proprietary formulas that had made our products stand out in the market. I knew which clients would follow me without hesitation. I knew which distributors would sign new agreements the moment I reached out. I didn't need a coup. I just needed a clean exit. And that's exactly what I built. I sent the legal notifications to our partners late Saturday evening under my new entity's letterhead, all properly formatted, signed, and time-stamped. Every piece of intellectual property I had developed was now filed under my name. Every supplier who mattered most had already agreed to transition contracts to the new entity effective immediately. By the time they realized what had happened, the ink would be dry, the infrastructure gone, and they'd be left with a brand name on paper and nothing of substance behind it. On Sunday evening, I was making dinner when my phone lit up with a call from my mother. I didn't answer. A few minutes later, a voicemail notification popped up, and I played it on speaker while chopping vegetables with a calmness that felt almost surreal. Her voice was tight, panicked, brittle in a way I hadn't heard in years. "Claire, what the hell is going on? I'm getting calls from suppliers saying they're terminating contracts. People are talking. This isn't funny. Call me back immediately." I turned the burner down to low and smiled faintly. Because this wasn't a prank. This wasn't petty. This wasn't me lashing out in a moment of hurt. This was a woman taking back what she built, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, reputation by reputation. This was the art of the exit, not just leaving the room, but taking the walls with you. There was a peculiar kind of stillness in the air that Monday morning, the kind that only comes before something breaks wide open, a silence too perfect, too expectant, like a curtain drawn right before the first act of a performance no one realizes will end in total ruin. I walked into the boardroom with slow, deliberate steps, heels echoing across the marble floor, my portfolio tucked beneath one arm, my expression unreadable, calm as ever, even as chaos waited just on the other side of the room's false peace. The walls were lined with fresh flower arrangements, the coffee was already poured, and the large screen at the far end displayed the company logo as if it still meant something to me, as if it still held power over what I was about to do. Ethan was already seated at the head of the table, legs crossed, fingers steepled like he was preparing to deliver a TED Talk instead of be publicly dismantled. He wore that same smug expression he'd been perfecting since childhood, the one that said he'd never doubted this moment would come, not because he'd earned it, but because people like him were raised to believe the throne would always be handed to them eventually, as long as they showed up with just enough charm to distract from their mediocrity. He nodded at me casually as I entered, like he thought I was there to support his coronation instead of orchestrate a quiet execution. My mother sat beside him, pearls around her neck and a clipboard in her lap, her face carefully neutral but her eyes twitching just enough to betray that she knew something was coming, something she couldn't quite define, but feared all the same. My father, as always, sat stiffly in the corner, silent and passive, choosing once again to play the part of the man who only steps in after the damage is already done. The rest of the board filtered in behind me, a few longtime investors, some department heads, and of course, Lisa Granger, who took her seat beside me without a word, her lips pulled into a polite but faintly amused smile, as if she'd been waiting for this exact show to begin. I didn't wait for permission to speak. I opened my folder, pulled out the thick stack of documents I had spent the weekend finalizing, and began distributing them across the table, one by one, watching as the silence shifted into confusion, then disbelief, then a flicker of fear. "What you're holding," I said clearly, my voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the stale air, "are formal notices of withdrawal from the national branch as it currently stands, along with supporting documents to dissolve the subsidiary under the current corporate structure." The sound of paper rustling filled the room as hands flipped through pages they barely understood, eyes widening as they scanned terms and clauses they hadn't realized were even in the agreement they'd all signed years ago. Effective immediately, I continued. I will be activating the Executive Realignment Contingency Clause, which gives me the full legal authority to spin off the national entity and restructure it under a new corporate identity, where I will serve as the acting CEO and majority shareholder. Ethan sat upright so quickly his chair screeched against the floor. "You can't do that," he blurted, voice cracking in disbelief. That clause was hypothetical. It was meant for emergencies. I turned to him slowly, meeting his panicked gaze with a steady calm that I had honed through years of being dismissed and overlooked. "And what would you call an unqualified leadership handoff that threatens stakeholder trust and operational stability if not a business emergency, Ethan?" He sputtered, flipping through the papers again like he could will them to change, eyes darting to our mother, silently begging her to step in. And, of course, she did. "This is sabotage," Helen said sharply, her voice rising in that high, brittle tone she always used when she felt power slipping through her fingers. "You're blowing up everything we've built because of a bruised ego." "No," I said, standing to my full height, eyes scanning every face at that table. "I'm preserving what I built. You're the ones who tried to hand it to someone who didn't earn it, and I simply refuse to let you strip it down in the name of family tradition and favoritism." My father said nothing, of course he didn't. He just stared at the documents, lips pressed into a thin line, choosing silence over siding with the daughter who'd carried his legacy for a decade. I gathered the rest of my papers, slid them back into my folder, and gave one last look around the room, the same room where I'd once fought tooth and nail for every inch of progress, every strategy, every decision that moved this company forward. "You can keep the building," I said quietly, adjusting the strap on my shoulder bag. "I already took everything that matters." And then, as if on cue, Lisa Granger stood, reached into her own folder, and pulled out the final signed agreement we'd prepared. She slid it to the center of the table, glanced briefly at Ethan's stunned expression, then looked directly at me. "Congratulations, Claire," she said smoothly, with the smallest hint of a grin. "Welcome to your company." And with that, the room shattered in silence. There's something profoundly poetic about watching a structure collapse not from an explosion, not from a scandal, not from some loud, chaotic downfall, but from the quiet, invisible erosion of loyalty walking out the door one person at a time. That's how it started in the weeks that followed the Monday morning massacre, not with fireworks or press releases or dramatic public statements, but with a steady, unshakable wave of resignations from the people who had built the heart of the business right alongside me. No protests, no complaints, just signed letters placed neatly on desks, warm handshakes exchanged in hallways, and a silent understanding that where I was going, they were going too. By the end of the first week, 3 of the company's highest-performing department leads had handed in their notice, each citing new opportunities aligned with long-term vision, the polite language that said everything without saying too much. By the second week, over 24 team members from operations, strategy, marketing, and product development followed, many of them reaching out to me directly not to ask for a job, but to tell me they were already in. These weren't just employees. They were the architects of innovation, the ones who knew the blueprints better than anyone, the ones who had stayed late, worked weekends, fought through logistical nightmares and unreasonable timelines simply because they believed in the direction we were building toward. And when I walked away, they didn't hesitate to walk with me. And then the clients started moving too. At first, Helen and Ethan tried to spin it like a minor adjustment period in leadership, some transitional turbulence that would settle in time. But by week 3, the numbers told a different story. Key distribution contracts were redirected. National retailers requested meetings with my new venture. Wholesale partners began pulling orders from the original catalog and requesting new agreements under my brand. The revenue chart took its first hit by the second Friday, and by the end of the third week, sales had dropped by nearly half. The same people who once toasted to our growth were now quietly funneling business to my side of the fence because in the end, it wasn't just the name they had trusted, it was me. I didn't gloat. I didn't speak to the media. I didn't leak documents or smear anyone's reputation. I just kept working, kept building, kept showing up every day with the same drive and clarity I had always brought to the table. But this time, it was mine, every decision, every win, every milestone. And I didn't need applause anymore. I just needed peace. Helen tried to schedule a meeting by the end of the fourth week, her email laced with desperation beneath a thin veil of diplomacy. "We'd like to explore possibilities for reconciliation," she wrote, as if we were estranged friends instead of former business partners who had tried to erase me from the empire I built. I met her in a neutral location, out of respect for what once was, not because I owed her anything. She came dressed in her usual elegance, the same pearls, the same practiced smile, but her posture had changed just slightly, just enough. She was a woman who knew the ground had shifted beneath her, but didn't yet know how to stand on uneven terrain. She tried to speak softly, tried to spin it as a misunderstanding, a miscommunication, something that could be repaired if only I would come back and help realign the family's vision. I let her speak. I let her fill the room with carefully chosen words and hollow sentiment. And then, when she finally paused, when her voice caught for a split second under the weight of her own performance, I looked her straight in the eye and said, "You didn't want me as a leader. You wanted me quiet." There was nothing else to say after that. Ethan was officially removed from his position less than a month later. The board cited performance concerns and leadership instability, though no one needed an explanation. Everyone knew what had happened. The company became a shell, a ghost of the legacy I had poured myself into, a nameplate on a door with nothing substantial behind it. They kept the building, sure. But the soul was gone. The value was gone. The engine that powered everything had walked out with me, and I hadn't looked back since. I continued to grow my new venture quietly, methodically, with the kind of freedom I hadn't tasted in years. The staff that followed me thrived. The clients who transitioned remained loyal. The investors who once hedged their bets now placed them squarely behind me, and not a single one regretted it. I didn't need a media campaign. I didn't need headlines. I just needed results, and I delivered. One evening, months later, I met Lisa Granger for dinner, the same woman who had backed me from the very beginning, who had watched me pull the strings with surgical grace, while everyone else underestimated my resolve. She raised her glass toward me as we finished our meal and said, "That was bold." I smiled, but this time it wasn't sharp or guarded or bitter. It was calm, content, solid. "No," I said simply. "That was overdue." Because sometimes the only way to reclaim your worth is to stop giving it away to people who only value it when it benefits them. And sometimes the only revenge worth taking is the one that comes not with fire and fury, but with silence, success, and the kind of undeniable impact no one can rewrite or erase. Funny how they only saw my worth when I stopped giving it away for free.